Deathworld, Chapter 23, by Harry Harrison, read by Gerald Frost. Tree branches had broken the lifeboat's fall. The bow rockets had burned out in the emergency blast, and the swamp had cushioned the landing a bit. It was still a crash. The battered cylinder sank slowly into the stagnant water and the thin mud of the swamp. The bow was well under before Jason managed to kick open the emergency hatch in the waist. There was no way of knowing how long it would take for the boat to go under, and Jason was in no condition to ponder the situation. Concussed and bloody, he had just enough drive left to get himself out. Wading and falling, he made his way to firmer land, sitting down heavily as soon as he found something that would support him. Behind him, the lifeboat burbled and sank under the water. Bubbles of trapped air kept rising for a while, then they stopped. The water stilled, and, except for the broken branches and trees, there was no sign that a ship had ever come this way. Insects whined across the swamp, and the only sound that broke the quiet of the woods beyond was the cruel scream of an animal pulling down its dinner. When that had echoed away in tiny waves of sound, everything was silent. Jason pulled himself out of the half-trance with an effort. His body felt like it had been through a meat grinder, and it was almost impossible to think with the fog in his head. After minutes of deliberation, he figured out that the med kit was what he needed. The easy-off snap was very difficult, and the button release didn't work. He finally twisted his arm around until it was under the orifice and pressed his entire unit down against it. It buzzed industriously, though he couldn't feel the needles. He guessed it had worked. His sight spun dizzily for a while and then cleared. Painkillers went to work, and he slowly came out of the dark cloud that had enveloped his brain. Reason returned, and loneliness rode along with it. He was without food, friendless, surrounded by hostile forces of an alien planet. There was a rising panic that started deep inside of him, that took concerted effort to hold down. "Think, Jason, don't emote," he said aloud to reassure himself, but it was instantly a sorrowful thing, because his voice sounded weak in the emptiness, with a ragged edge of hysteria to it. Something caught in his throat, and he coughed to clear it, spitting out blood. Looking at the red stain, he was suddenly angry, hating this deadly planet and the incredible stupidity of the people who lived on it. Cursing out loud was better, and his voice didn't sound so weak now. He ended up shouting and shaking his fist at nothing in particular, but it helped. The anger washed away his fear and brought him back to reality. Sitting on the ground felt good now. The sun was warm, and when he leaned his back, he could almost forget the unending burden of the double gravity. Anger had carried away fear, rest eased fatigue, and from somewhere in the back of his mind there popped up the old platitude, "Where there's life, there's hope." He grimaced at the triteness of the words, and at the same time realized that a basic truth lurked there. Count his assets. Well battered, but still alive. None of the bruises seemed very important, and no bones were broken. He had his gun. It was still working. It dipped in and out of the power holster as he thought about it. Pyreans made rugged equipment. The medkit was operating as well. If he kept his senses, managed to walk in a fairly straight line, and could live off the land, there was a fair chance he might make it back to the city. What kind of reception would be waiting for him there was a different matter altogether. He would find out that after he arrived. Getting there had to be his first priority. On the debit side, there stood the strong planet Pyrrhus. Strength-sapping gravity, murderous weather, violent animals. Could he survive? As if to add emphasis to his thoughts, the sky darkened over and rain hissed into the forest. It was marching towards him. Jason scrambled to his feet and took a bearing before the rain closed down visibility. A jagged chain of mountains stood dimly on the horizon. He remembered crossing them on the flight out. They would do as a good first goal. After he had reached them, he would worry about the next leg of the journey. Leaves and dirt flew before him in the wind in thick gusts. Then the rain washed over him. Soaked, chilled, already bone-tired, he pitted the tottering strength of his legs against the planet of death. When nightfall came, it was still raining. There was no way of being sure of the direction and no point in going on. If that wasn't enough, Jason was on the ragged edge of exhaustion. It was going to be a wet night. All the trees were thick boled and slippery. He couldn't have climbed them even on a 1G world. The sheltered spots he investigated, under fallen trees and beneath thick bushes, were just as wet as the rest of the forest. In the end, he curled up in the leeward side of a tree and fell asleep, shivering, with water dripping off of him. The rain stopped around midnight, and the temperature fell sharply. Jason woke sluggishly from a dream in which he was being frozen to death to find out it was true. Fine snow was sifting through the trees, powdering the ground and drifting against him. The cold bit into his flesh, and when he squeezed, it hurt his chest. His aching and numb body only wanted to rest, but the spark of reason remained in him, forcing him to his feet. If he lay down now, he would die. Holding one hand against the tree so he wouldn't fall down, he began to trudge around it. Step after shuffling step, around and around, until the terrible cold eased a bit and he could stop shivering. Fatigue crawled up him in a muffling gray blanket. He kept on walking, half the time with his eyes open, closing them only when he fell and had to climb painfully up to his feet again. The sun burned away the snow and clouds at dawn. Jason leaned against a tree and blinked up at the sky with sore eyes. The ground was white in all directions, except the tree where his stumbling feet had churned a circle of black mud. His back against the smooth trunk, Jason sank slowly to the ground, letting the sun soak into him. Exhaustion had left him lightheaded, and his lips were cracked from thirst. Almost continuous coughing tore at his chest with fingers of fire. Though the sun was still low, it was hot already, burning his skin dry and hot. It isn't right. The thought kept nagging at his brain until he admitted it, turned it over and over, and looked at it from all sides. What wasn't right? Oh, the way he felt. Pneumonia. He had all the symptoms. His dry lips cracked and blood moistened them when he smiled. He had already avoided all the animal perils of Pyrrhus, the big carnivores and the poisonous reptiles, only to be laid low by the smallest beast of them all. Well, he had a remedy for this one too. Rolling up his sleeve with shaky fingers, he pressed the mouth of the med kit to his bare arm. It clicked and began to drone an angry whine. That meant something, he knew, but he just couldn't remember what. Holding it up, he saw that one of the hypodermics was projecting halfway from its socket. Of course. It was empty of whatever antibiotic the analyzer had called for. It needed refilling. Jason hurtled the thing away with a curse, and it splashed into a pool and was gone. End of medicine, end of medikit, end of Jason Denault. Single-handed battler against the perils of Deathworld, strong-hearted struggler who could do as well as the natives. It had taken him all of one day to get his own death warrant signed. A choking growl echoed behind him. He turned and dropped and fired in the same instant. It was all over before his conscious mind was aware that it had happened. Pyrean training and conditioning had his reflexes on the precortical level. Jason gaped at the ugly beast dying not a meter from him and realized it had been trained very well. His first reaction was unhappiness that he had killed one of the grubber dogs. When he looked closer, he realized the animal was slightly different in markings, size, and temper. Though most of the forequarters were blown away, blood still pumped out in dying spurts. It kept trying to reach Jason. Before the eyes glazed with death, it had struggled all the way almost to his feet. It wasn't quite a grubber dog, though chances were it was a wild relative, bearing the same resemblance to a dog as a wolf. He wondered if there was any other resemblance between the wolves and this dead beast. Did they hunt in packs too? As soon as the thought hit him, he looked up. Not a moment too soon. The great forms were drifting through the trees, closing in on him. He shot one or two. The others snarled with rage and sank back into the forest. They didn't leave. Instead of being frightened by the death, they grew even more enraged. Jason sat with his back to the tree and waited until they came close before he picked one off. With each shot and dying scream, the outraged survivors howled louder. Some of them fought when they met, venting their rage. One stood on his hind legs and raked great strips of bark from a tree. Jason aimed a shot at it, but he was too far away to hit it. There were advantages to having a fever, he realized. Logically, he knew he would only live until sunset, or until his gun was empty. Yet the fact did not bother him greatly. Nothing really mattered. He slumped, relaxed completely, only raising his arm to fire and then letting it drop again. Every few minutes he had to move to look in back of the tree and kill any of them that were stalking up on him in the blind spot. He wished dimly that he were leaning against a smaller tree, but it wasn't worth the effort to go get one. Sometime in the afternoon, he fired his last shot. It killed an animal that he had allowed to get close. He had noticed he was missing the longer shots. The beast snarled and dropped. The others that were close pulled back and howled in sympathy. One of them exposed himself to Jason, and Jason pulled the trigger. There was only a slight click. He tried it again in case it was a misfire, but there was still only the click. The gun was empty, as was the spare clip at his belt. There were vague memories of reloading, though he could not remember how many times he had done it. Then, this is the end. They had been right. The Pyrrhus was too much of a match for him. Though they shouldn't talk. It would kill them all in the end. Pyrrhians never died in bed. Old Pyrrhians never died. They just got it. Now that he didn't have to force himself to stay alert and hold the gun, the fever took hold. He wanted to sleep, and he knew it would be a very long sleep. His eyes were almost closed as he watched the wary carnivores slip closer to him. The first one crept close enough to spring. He could see the muscles tensing in its legs. It leaped, whirling in midair, and falling before it reached him. Blood ran from its gaping mouth and the short shaft of metal that projected from the side of its head. The two men that walked out of the brush looked down at him. Their mere presence seemed to have been enough for the carnivores, because they all vanished. Grubbers. He had been in such a hurry to reach the city that he had forgotten all about the grubbers. It was a good thing that they were here, and Jason was very glad they had come. He couldn't talk very well, so he smiled to thank them, but his lips hurt too much, and he went to sleep. Chapter 24. For a strange length of time after that, there were only hazy patches of memory that impressed themselves on Jason. A sense of movement and large beasts around him. Walls, wood smoke, and the murmur of voices. None of it meant very much, and he was too tired to care. It was easier and much better just to let go. "About time," Rez said. "A couple more days lying there like that, and we would have buried you, even if you were still breathing." Jason blinked at him, trying to focus on the face that swam about above him. He finally recognized Rez, and wanted to answer him, but that only brought on a spell of body-racking coughs. Someone held a cup to his lips, and sweet fluid trickled down his throat. He rested, and then tried again. "How long have I been here?" The voice was thin and sounded far away. Jason had trouble recognizing it as his own. 8 days. And why didn't you listen when I told you? I told you! You should have stayed near the ship. And where you crashed. Didn't you remember what I said about coming down anywhere on this continent? No matter, too late to worry about that. Next time, listen to what I say. Our people moved fast and reached the site of the wreck before dark. They found the broken trees and the spot where your ship had sunk, and at first thought whatever had been in it had drowned. Then one of the dogs found your trail, but lost it in the swamps during the night. They had a fine time with the mud and snow and didn't have any luck finding your spoor again. But the next afternoon they were ready to send for more help when they heard you firing. Just made it from what I hear. Lucky one of them was a talker and could tell the wild dogs to clear out. Would have had to kill them all otherwise, and that's not healthy. Thanks for saving my neck, Jason said. That was a lot closer than I like to come. What happened? I was sure I was done for. I remembered that much. Diagnosed with all the symptoms of pneumonia. Guaranteed fatal in my condition without treatment. Looks like you were wrong when you said most of your remedies were useless. They seem to work on me. His voice died off as Rez shook his head in a slow no. Lines of worry sharp cut into his face. Jason looked around and saw Naxa and another man. They had the same deeply unhappy expression as Rez. What is it? What is it? Jason asked, feeling the trouble, feeling the foreboding. If your remedies didn't work, then what did? Not my med kit. That was empty. I remember losing it or throwing it away. You were dying, Rez said slowly. We couldn't cure you. Only Junkman medicine could do that. We got one from the driver of your food truck. But how? Jason asked, dazed. You told me the city forbids you medicine. He couldn't give you his own? Not while he was... Rez nodded and finished the sentence. Dead. Of course he was dead. I killed him myself, and with a great deal of pleasure. This hit Jason hard. He sagged against the pillows and thought of all those who had died since he came to this Pyrrhus. The men who had died to save him. He died so he could live. Died because of his ideas. It was a burden of guilt that he could not bear to think about it. Would it stop with Cranon? Or would the city people try to avenge his death? Don't you realize what this means? He gasped. Cranon's death will turn the city against you. There will be no more supplies. They'll attack you when they can. They'll kill your people. Of course we know that. Rez leaned forward, his voice hoarse and intent. It wasn't an easy decision to make. We have always had a trading agreement with the Junkmen. The trading trucks were inviolate. This was our last and only link to the galaxy and eventual hope of contacting them. Yet you broke that link to save me. Why? Only you can answer that question completely. There was a great attack on the city, and we saw their walls broken. They had to move back at one place, and the same time a spaceship was over the ocean dropping bombs of some kind. The flash was reported, and then the ship returned, and you left in a smaller ship. They fired at you, but didn't kill you. The little ship wasn't destroyed either. We are sending a team to raise it now. What does it all mean? We have no way of telling. We only know it was something vitally important. You were alive, but would obviously die before you could talk. The small ship might be repaired to fly. Perhaps that was your plan, and that's why you stole it for us. We couldn't let you die, not even if it meant all-out war with the city. The situation was explained to all our people who could be reached by screen, and they voted to save you. I killed the Junkman for his medicine, then rode 2 Dyrins to death to get there in time. Now, tell us, what does it mean? What is your plan? How will it help us? Guilt leaned on Jason as he stifled his mouth. A fragment of an ancient legend cut across his mind about Jonah, who had wrecked a spacer so that all in it died, yet he lived. Was that he? Had he wrecked a world? Could he dare admit to these people that he had taken the lifeboat only to save his own miserable life? These 3 Pyrians leaned forward and waited for his words. Jason closed his eyes so he wouldn't see their faces. What could he tell them? If he admitted the truth, they would undoubtedly kill him on the spot, considering it only justice. He wasn't fearful for his own life anymore, but if he died, the other deaths would all have been in vain. And there was still a way to end this planetary war. All the facts were available now. It was just a matter of putting them together. If only he weren't so tired, he could see the solution. It was right there, lurking around a corner, hiding in his brain, waiting to be dragged out. Whatever he did, he couldn't admit the truth now. If he died, all hope died. He had to lie again to gain time, then find the true solution as soon as he was able. It was all he could do. "You were right," Jason said haltingly. "The small ship has an interstellar drive in it. Perhaps it can still be saved. Even if it can't, there is another way. I can't explain it now, but I will tell you when I am rested. Don't worry. The fight is almost over." They laughed and pounded each other on the back. When they came to shake his hand as well, he collapsed, and his eyes made believe that he was asleep. It is very hard to be a hypocrite when you're not trained to it. Rez woke him up early the next morning. "Do you feel well enough to travel?" "Depends on what you mean by travel," Jason told him. "If you mean under my own power, I doubt if I could get as far as that door." You'll be carried," Rez broke in. "We have a litter strung between two doryrooms. Not too comfortable, but you'll get there. But only if you think you're well enough to move. We called all the people within riding distance, and they are beginning to gather. By this afternoon, we will have enough men and doryrooms to pull this ship out of the swamp." "I'll come," Jason said, pushing himself into a sitting position. That minor effort exhausted him, bringing a wave of nausea. Only by leaning his full weight against the wall could he keep himself from falling back. He sat, propped there, until he heard shouts and the stamping of heavy feet outside, and they came to carry him. The trip drained all his meager stores of energy, and he fell into an exhausted sleep. When he opened his eyes, the doryrooms were standing knee-deep in the swamp, and the salvage operation had begun. Ropes vanished out of sight into the water, while lines of struggling animals and men hauled at them. The beasts bellowed. The men cursed as they slipped and fell. All the Pyreans were tugging on the lines that weren't male. Women were in there as well. Shorter on the average than the men, they were just as brawny. Their clothing was varied and many-colored, the first touches of decoration Jason had seen on this planet. Getting the ship up was a heartbreaking job. The mud sucked at it, and the underwater roots caught on the vines. Divers plunged time and time again into the brown water, cutting them free. Progress was incredibly slow, but the work never stopped. Jason's brain was working even slower. The ship would be hauled out eventually. What would he do then? He had to have a new plan by that time, but thinking was impossible work. His thoughts were corkscrewed, and he had to fight down the rising feeling of panic. The sun was lower in the sky when the ship's nose finally appeared above the water. A ragged cheer broke out at the first sight of the battered cone of metal, and they went ahead with new energy. Jason was the first one who noticed the dory rim weaving towards them. The dog saw it, of course, and ran out and sniffed. The rider shouted to the dogs and kicked angrily at the sides of his mount. Even at this distance, Jason could see that the beast's heaving sides and yellow foam-flecked hide. It was barely able to stagger now, and the man jumped down, running ahead on foot. He was shouting something as he ran, and he couldn't be heard above the noise. There was a single moment when the sounds slacked a bit, and the running man's voice could be heard. He was calling the same word over and over again. It sounded like wait, but Jason couldn't be sure. Others had heard it, and the result was instantaneous. They stopped, unmoving, exactly where they were. Many of them let go of the ropes. Only the quick action of the anchormen kept the ship from sliding back under, dragging the harnessed doryms with it. A wake of silence washed across the swamp in the wake of the running man's shouts. They could be clearly heard now. "Quake! Quake's on the way! South! Only safe way is south! One by one, the ropes dropped back into the water, and the Pyreans turned to wade to solid land. Before they were well started, Reyes' voice cracked out. Stay at work! Get the ship up! It's our only hope now! I'll talk to Hannes and find out how much time we have. Those solitary people were unused to orders. They stopped and milled about a bit, reason fighting with the urgent desire to run. One by one, they stepped back to the ropes as they worked out the sense of Reyes' words. As soon as it was clear the work would continue, he turned away. What is it? What's happening? Sorry. What is it? What's happening? Jason called to him as he ran by. It's Hannes, Reyes said, stopping by the litter, waiting for the newcomer to reach him. He's a quake man. They know when quakes are coming, before they happen. Hannes ran up, panting and tired. He was a short man, built like a barrel on stubby legs, with a great white beard covering his neck and the top of his chest. Another time, Jason might have laughed at the incongruous waddle, but not now. There was a charging difference in the air since the man arrived. Why didn't you have somebody near a plate? I called over this area over and over. No answer. Finally, had to come myself. How much time do we have? Rez cut in. We have to get that ship out before we pull out. Time? Who knows about time? The graybeard cursed. Get out or you're dead. Calm down, Han, Rez said in a quieter voice, taking the oldster's arms in both his hands. You know what we're doing. You know how much depends upon getting that ship up. Now, how does it feel? Is this going to be a fast one or a slow one? Fast. Faster than anything I've felt in a long time. She's starting all the way through. If you've heard a plate here, I'd bet If you had a plate here, I'd bet Match or someone else up near the Firelands would be reporting on the new eruptions. It's on the way. If we don't get out soon, we're not going to get out tall. There was a burble of water as the ship was hauled out a bit farther. No one was talking now, and there was a fierce urgency in their movements. Jason still wasn't exactly sure what had happened. Don't shoot me for a foreigner, he said, but just what's wrong? Are you expecting an earthquake here? Are you sure? Sure, Hannes screeched. Of course I'm sure. If I wasn't sure, I wouldn't be a quake man. It's on its way. There's no doubt about that, Rez added. I don't know how you can tell on your planet when quakes or volcanism are going to start. Machines, maybe. We have nothing like that. But quake men, like Hannes here, always know about it before they happen. The word can be passed fast enough, we get away. The quake is coming, all right. The only thing in doubt now is how much time we have to leave. The work went on, and there was a good chance that they would die long before it was finished. All for nothing. The only way Jason could get them to stop would be to admit the ship was useless. He wouldn't be killed then, and the grubbers would have a chance to die without him. He chewed his lip as the sun set and the work continued by torchlight. Hannes paced around, grumbling under his breath, halting only to glance at the northern horizon. The people felt his restlessness and transmitted it to their animals. Dogfights broke out among the doryms. Dogfights broke out, and the doryms pulled reluctantly at their harnesses. With each passing second, chances grew slimmer, and Jason searched desperately for a way out of his own trap. Look, someone said, and they all turned. The sky to the north was lit with red light. There was a rumble in the ground, and that was felt more than heard. The surface of the water blurred and then broke into patterns of tiny waves. Jason turned away from the light, looking at the water and the ship. It was higher now. On top, the top of the stern was exposed. There was a gaping hole, blasted through the metal by the spaceship's guns. Rez, he called, his words jamming through in a rush altogether. Look, the ship at that hole blasted in her stern. I landed on the rockets and didn't know how badly she was hit, but the guns have hit the star drive. Rez gaped at him unbelieving as he went on. Improvising, he played it by ear, trying to manufacture lies that rang of truth. I watched them install the drive. It's auxiliary to the regular engines. It's bolted onto the hull right there. It's gone now. Blown up. The boat will never leave this planet, much less get to another star. He couldn't look Rez in the eye after that. He sank back into the furs that had been propped up behind him, feeling like the weakness was even more a part of him. Rez was silent, and Jason couldn't tell if his story had been believed. Only when the Pyrean bent and slashed the nearest rope did he know he had won. The word passed from man to man, and the ropes were cut silently. Behind them, the ship that they had labored so hard over sank back into the water. None of them watched. Each was locked in his own world of thought as they formed up to leave. As soon as the doryms were saddled and packed, they started out, Hananis leading the way. Within minutes, they were all moving, a single file that vanished into the darkness. Jason's litter had been left behind. It would have been smashed to pieces in the night march. Rez pulled him up into the saddle before him, locking his body into place with a steel-hard arm. The trek began. When they left the swamp, they changed directions sharply. A little later, Jason knew why, when the southern sky exploded. Flames lit the scene brightly. Ashes shifted down, and hot lumps of rock crashed into the trees. They steamed when they hit, and if they hadn't been the earlier rain, they would have been faced with a forest fire as well. Something large loomed up next to the line of the march, and when they crossed an open space, Jason looked at the reflections from the sky. "Rez," he said, pointing. Rez looked at the great beast moving next to them, shaggy body and twisting horns as high as their shoulders, and then looked away. He wasn't frightened or apparently interested. Jason looked around them and then began to understand. All of the fleeing animals made no sound. That's why he hadn't noticed them before. But on both sides, dark forms raced between the trees. Some he recognized, most he didn't. For a few minutes, a pack of wild dogs ran near them, even mingled with the domesticated dogs. No notice was taken. Flying things flapped overhead. Under the greater threat of the volcanoes, all battles were forgotten. Life respected life. A herd of fat, pig-like beasts with curling tusks blundered through the line. The doryms slowed, picking their steps carefully so they wouldn't trod upon them. Smaller animals sometimes clung to the backs of bigger ones, riding untouched for a while before they leaped off. Pounded mercilessly by the saddle, Jason fell wearily into a light sleep. It was shot through with dreams of the rushing animals, hurrying on forever in silence. With his eyes open or shut, he saw the same endless stream of beasts. It all meant something, and he frowned as he tried to think of what. Animals running. Pyrean animals. He sat bolt upright suddenly, wide awake, staring down in comprehension. "What is it?" Hez asked. "Go on," Jason said. "Get us out of this, get us to safety. I told you the lifeboat wasn't the only answer. I know how to get your people what they want, and to end this war. There is a war, and there is a way to end it. I now know how that can be done." Chapter 25. And I'll stop there, and we'll read some more tomorrow night.